everyone. Welcome to the next edition, the fifth edition of the Hot Politics Lab online series. And I see many familiar faces among the list of attendees. So I think by now we know the drill. Since the university is closed, we're meeting online and we're having speakers and attendees across the world. Hello to all of our North American attendees today. And generally, the Hot Politics Lab tries to bring insights, use insights from political psychology to understand all kinds of important affairs in the world. And of course, with the coronavirus still spreading all around us, the Hot Politics Lab is dedicating these few weeks to trying to understand coronavirus from a political psychology perspective. So therefore, we have a guest today, and I will yield the virtual floor to Bert Bakker to introduce her.
Yeah, thank you, Gijs. Welcome, everybody. It's a pleasure to introduce to you Shana Gadarian, somebody who was high on our list, at least to come over to Amsterdam at some point, and I'm at least very happy that now with the corona crisis we at least have an opportunity to meet Shana in the online person. Shana is an associate professor of political science at Syracuse University, has a PhD from Princeton, and wrote a very influential and excellent book on the role of anxiety in politics that came out in Cambridge University Press and was awarded the Robert E. Lane Award for Best Book in Political Psychology by the American Political Science Association in 2016. Other than that, Shana has published very widely in journals such as Journal of Politics, American Journal of Political Science and Political Analysis, and does excellent work in the field of political psychology broadly. Moreover, as we've seen on Twitter, and she will also talk about today a little bit, she is also engaged with recent work on the COVID-19 crisis. And so with that, I'm very happy to hand the floor to you, Shana.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. I wish we were together in person, and I will at some point take up an invitation to come to Amsterdam. I am going to talk today about my recent work on anxiety in politics. I'm trying to share my screen, so just give me 1 second. And I'm going to focus a bit on the book that I wrote with Bethany Albertson on the role of anxiety in politics, and then I will shift and talk a little bit about my recent work with Sarah Wallace Goodman and Tom Kopinski on COVID-19. I usually start with a spiel about how important emotion is in politics. I don't have to do that for you because you all have accepted, I think, that emotion is an integral part of political life, and we can see that in areas such as public health or climate change, in terrorism and immigration. These are some of the areas that we look at in our book. And obviously in the most recent coronavirus crisis that we're still living through, the feelings of threat and anxiety influence the ways in which people think about politics, the kinds of policies they want to protect themselves, and who they put their trust in to try and both feel better and bring some level of protection to them. So just so we're kind of on the same page, I think it's just useful to think about the definition that we use in the book about what anxiety is. We talk about anxiety as an unpleasant and aversive state that comes from early warning signals of danger. And as you all know, anxiety is important to survival. We need to know what kind of threats there are in the environment in order to keep ourselves safe. Now, that doesn't always mean that anxiety is about the right things in politics or that it can't be used to manipulate people, but it does serve a very important purpose in both social and political life so that people have a way to identify what things are dangerous. Anxiety, it also comes again from this sense of threat and uncertainty about whether or not you yourself will be affected, and it is a negative state. And because anxiety is quite uncomfortable, people want to deal with that and cope with that, and they do that in a variety of ways. And we talk about, in Anxious Politics, we talk about three main ways that we see that people in political life deal with political anxiety, okay? The argument that we make in the book, the main argument, and then we apply this in different policy areas, is that political anxiety is quite uncomfortable. And what it leads to is people want protection. And so they support policies and political leaders that they believe will effectively protect them from threats. And that might be different leaders and different kinds of policies and different policy areas. And again, in the book, we talk about 4 different policy areas. We talk about immigration, threats from immigration, threats from climate change, terrorism, and public health. Today, I'm going to focus mostly on public health, but I'd be happy to talk about some of the other issue areas as well. When people are, again, uncomfortable and they want protection, they want political leaders, they want to put their trust in political leaders and policies they believe are protective, and they also seek out information that they believe that can be used to protect them from harm and mitigate those threats that have caused anxiety in the first place. Now, again, these are kind of our broad arguments, and we apply them in these different policy areas. And so in the book, the different empirical chapters look at these different coping mechanisms. Chapter 3, we look at political information seeking. Chapter 4, we look at trust in government, that is who citizens turn to in a time of crisis. And in Chapter 5, we look at our attitudes, that is the types of policies people, anxious citizens want. Again, across these policy areas, we think about our threats in a variety of ways. We look at what we call unframed threats. And I think this is a question that we can talk about in the Q&A, is whether or not the things that we labeled unframed threats or framed threats in the book really still apply. So particularly in coronavirus, I think it's worth kind of talking through whether or not what we label disease outbreaks as an unframed threat, whether or not that still applies in a much more polarized time. We think about unframed threats as those that are kind of widely agreed upon causes of harm, that these are harms that might include imminent bodily harm or death, and that it doesn't take a lot of work for elites to tell you you should be afraid of this kind of thing. So here we would put terrorist attacks, disease outbreaks like COVID-19, we put under unframed threats. Again, I think we can talk about in the Q&A whether or not this still applies, particularly in the US. In our framed threats, we talk about, these are areas where there is more debate about the cause of harms and where harms can be delayed, and where it would take more work for elites to convince the public that these things are in fact harmful and that they necessitate policy in order to protect them. So in here, we talk about, in comparison to disease outbreaks, we would think about something like the obesity epidemic, and in comparison to a terrorist attack on the day or the months after a terrorist attack, something like more like the war on terror, which is a more sustained kind of threat, and it takes more work from political elites to convince you of the need for policy change. Okay, so I'm going to just briefly talk through some of our findings on trust and anxiety, particularly in public health. I will say that almost all of the work in the book is experimental, and I would say I kind of look nice, but I spent 7 years trying to figure out how to scare people about politics, and so I'm happy to talk to any of you about manipulations and the ways in which those work in the experiments. So in our trust chapters, we look at how political anxiety affects trust and who it affects trust in. And what we argue is that political anxiety, again, opens people up and leads them to want protection. And so what this does is increases trust in people that the public believes will protect them against the harms that are causing them anxiety in the first place. So that is either they could help provide information for individuals or protect them directly from the harm. And this varies on the actor, because not all actors have expertise in the area. And so in public health, for instance, we expect that when people are anxious about, say, COVID-19 or smallpox in our studies, that they should put increased trust in people who can help give them information on how to protect themselves. And in the US, that's the Centers for Disease Control, that's the Food and Drug Administration, that's medical doctors, but it's not actors, political actors necessarily. Okay, and in our kind of more framed areas, our expectation is that how do we know who the experts are? Well, people put their trust in the political party that is seen as better on the issue, that is the issue owning party. That comes in less in the kind of public health work, but I'd be happy to come talk about that in the kind of issue ownership if we get to that in Q&A. So again, just briefly to talk a little bit more about this idea of party ownership, is that in the US, at least, the argument is that the parties are seen as better on some issues. And so when people are anxious about those issues, it should benefit the political leaders of those parties because they're seen as the experts. But in areas where there are clear experts, say in public health, we should see that anxiety should increase trust in those people with clear expertise. So in 2011, one of the studies in our book is a smallpox study where we ran an experiment with YouGov with 600 respondents, where we randomly assigned them to read either about a story that was not about smallpox, or we varied whether or not they read a story about a smallpox outbreak that had happened in the past. Just so we're clear, we did get IRB approval and debrief everyone, and even because smallpox is in fact a eradicated disease and there has not been an outbreak of it since the early 1980s, but we did tell people in our present outbreak condition that there was a current outbreak of smallpox that was happening, and the idea here is to vary how worried people are about a public health outbreak, but keep in the kind of two conditions, the area of smallpox constant. So we had them read a New York Times article in the smallpox condition. We had pre-tested a number of other diseases from the WHO about things that had been that are quite serious, and then we had also varied in some pre-testing to know whether or not this kind of past versus present would be able to increase anxiety. And this is the one, rather than kind of people versus animals or near versus far, this is the kind of combination that seemed to increase anxiety the most. So we had people, again, read this story about from the New York Times about an ongoing smallpox outbreak in the anxiety producing condition. We then asked people about their trust in a variety of political agencies and individuals to provide them information about smallpox, and also asked them a series of questions about civil liberties, about whether or not people who say with smallpox should be put in quarantine. So some of the same kinds of things that we're seeing in COVID-19, we asked because these are what WHO at the time was labeling as best practices for a potential outbreak of infectious disease. So you can just see, I'll breeze through this relatively quickly. We had 600 respondents. They were of generally good health. They are representative of the public in the United States, okay? And so just to show you, we asked people how strongly they felt a variety of emotions after they read the story. And we find that the present smallpox condition, reading about an outbreak, is in fact quite threatening to people. It made them feel anxious, and more so than reading about a smallpox outbreak that had happened in the past, and more so than reading about a non-smallpox story, okay? And here's where I think we can make the connection to COVID-19. We asked people to how much they trust different actors, including, again, relevant and irrelevant actors, to handle smallpox as an outbreak. And what we find is, I'm not showing you the control condition here. Here I'm just showing you the percentage of people who said they trusted each of these actors. The AMA is the American Medical Association, HHS is the Health and Human Services Agency, FDA, Food and Drug Administration, DHS is the Department of Homeland Security. You'll also notice we have some irrelevant actors at the bottom here. So Oprah, who holds herself out to be a health maven, if you will, but is not in fact a doctor, the Federal Reserve, and the Internal Revenue Service. We wanted to make sure that people weren't just increasing their trust in everyone. We wanted to make sure that they were in fact differentiating. And what we find is in these ones that are circled, we see a differentiation in who people trust in this present smallpox condition, that they're more likely to trust these health agencies than even people who read about smallpox that had happened in the past, okay? We also find among people who are higher anxiety, and this is measured post-treatment, that those people who are higher anxiety are more likely to support a variety of best practices that might protect people in a public health outbreak, but in fact would also deprive people of civil liberties, like requiring people to have a vaccine, destroying their property, making them quarantine. The support for those policies is higher among people who are anxious about public health, okay? I know I'm going quite quickly through all of this. I just want to cover the ground, and then I'll go to the COVID-19 findings, and then we can, I'm happy to answer any questions. So again, overall, and we have other trust studies. We have a study about immigration. We have another public health study where we ask about H1N1, which was in 2009. So we generally find that anxiety boosts trust in experts, in, again, people who can handle the threat. And the political context can shape who those experts are, particularly with frame threats. That applies more to our immigration findings. But I do think we're seeing a little bit of this in the COVID-19 outbreak, and thinking about which experts are deemed to be most appropriate, and how those messages might be undercut by political leaders. Okay, so like I said, I'm doing some work on COVID-19. We, with a National Science Foundation rapid grant, Sarah Wallace Goodman and I, and with Tom Kopinski, had a survey that we put out in the field a couple of weeks ago. We're about to go back in the field with the same respondents this week. We had 3,000 respondents, and we asked about a variety of health behaviors, including whether or not people are washing their hands, their social distancing. We also asked about separately some blame attribution, who is to blame for the lack of preparedness in the US, and a set of questions about immigration and trade attitudes. And the major story of these findings in COVID-19 is one, that there's major differences across the Democratic and Republican Party in who is anxious about COVID-19 and the behaviors that they're actually pursuing. So this is not to overwhelm you, but we had built in a set of experiments into this, I'll go back to that in a second, into this study with some messaging about who tells you that there's a threat and what you should do with it. And I will say, like, across all of the experimental treatments, we basically find nothing, no effects whatsoever, because what seems to be happening is that every effect that we see both on attitudes and behavior is simply driven by partisanship. So these are odds ratios looking at whether or not people are comparing Democrats and people who have no party affiliation to Republicans, in whether or not people are changing their behavior. That's on the left, the panel A rather, whether they've visited the doctor, they've changed their travel plans, avoided gatherings. We find Democrats in our study, and this is similar to findings in other studies as well. Democrats are just more likely to report that they are doing all of the behaviors in social distancing than Republicans. So it's not every single. If you just eyeball this, those Democrat odds ratios are basically significant on all of these compared to Republicans. And on attitudes, things like Democrats estimate that there are going to be more deaths than Republicans, and this is in late March. They're more worried about the negative effect on the economy. They're more worried that a friend will get sick. So there are major differences across parties in terms of how worried people are and what they're actually doing to deal with that worry based on their party identification. And this is controlling for where they live, their age, their income, and whether or not there are cases of coronavirus, or how many cases are in the zip code that they live in. So I'm going to just skip a little bit about the blame I want to get to the blame attribution and just and then I'll wrap up. So we also asked people for to rank 4 actors and how and who is responsible for the lack of preparedness. And we asked them about President Trump, former President Barack Obama, their state governors, and the CDC. And so if you look at this left panel of who is most responsible, and we asked people to rank all of these people, Democrats are just much more likely to blame the current president than any other actor. And that is also true of people without a party affiliation, compared to Republicans here at the bottom, who blame the CDC and former President Obama significantly more than they blame the current president. And then in this, similarly, if you look at who people blame, who people give credit to as least responsible, right? So who we don't blame, Democrats don't blame Barack Obama, and the Republicans do not blame the current president, in part because of, we argue, shared party affiliation. Okay. So I'm going to just stop there. I have lots more to say. Looking forward to your questions. The conclusion is the anxiety is incredibly consequential for contemporary politics. And what we find is that it increases support for expert actors and policies that the public will perceives will protect them. But that protection is determined by the political context. And here in 2020 seems to be determined in part also by your own party affiliation. Okay, so that's what I have.
Great, thanks a lot, Shana. We will now move to the Q&A, and as always, you can, if you hit the Q&A button on the down on the screen, then you can type your question, and then I will read out the questions of the participants. I currently have no question yet, so let me. Oh wait, there's a question from Christian. Actually, yeah, let's move to Christian.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. Super interesting. I would be interested. So I have 2 questions. One short one is just you show that Republicans are blaming Obama. What's the story behind there? What are they actually blaming Obama for in the current COVID-19? I don't. As an outsider from not the U.S. context, it seems very weird and strange. And the other question is then, you show that anxiety leads to accepting these measures that restrict civil liberties, and then this is also interferes with trust in the institutions that govern these or that enact these restrictions. That reminds me of the first talk that we had by Michael Bank-Peterson, who was labeling this as optimistic anxiety, where you have to make people anxious to follow these procedures, but you also have to give them some hope, some optimism about how that works. So is it purely trust, or do you see that there's also this positive emotion of hope, this positive emotion has a role here?
Yeah, okay, these are great questions. So I'll take the first one first, which is, why do Republicans blame Obama for lack of preparedness? So I think there's 2 answers. The one is partially there's a kind of right-wing media argument that the current president could not have done any better because there wasn't enough. He didn't inherit enough capacity to protect people, and that this was basically out of his control. So there's some of that And I do think some of this is just reflective casting of blame on the other party. So this is a bit of kind of negative partisanship that is that we're just seeing. The only actor that we gave people to blame, who was a politician who was not a Republican, was Barack Obama. In this next round of studies, and so my instinct is that if we gave people Democrats in Congress to blame, Republicans would put their blame there rather than Barack Obama. This isn't really about Obama necessarily. And so in this next round that we're sending out today, we're varying whether or not people are seeing Democrats in Congress or Obama, because I want to actually test that. So that's the first thing. The second thing, the second question about optimistic anxiety, I like this idea. I would think of it more in terms of resilience. I do think generally that anxiety is important in the first place to get people to comply with these stringent and quite difficult measures, right? So staying home, you know, and not doing the normal things we do in social life, not going to work, not having schools open. These are things that are actually difficult for people. And then I do think that once you get over that hump of getting people to comply, that this kind of idea of hope or resilience, I think, is really important. So I agree with Michael Bang-Peterson's idea. I think of it less as, I think you need to show people what is the effect, because I do think what is really difficult for people is counterfactual thinking. I think the idea of knowing what would have happened had we not done things is very hard for people to understand. And so maybe we need to change, maybe it's hope, or in the future that things will be better. I think the other thing to think about, maybe a different frame, is how many people we have saved by staying home, or how many, you know, so what is the positive case for this kind of counterfactual? Who are the people who are now safe, who would have been sick had we not done what we did? But I do think you're right to think that there is another phase after anxiety in order to get people to keep complying.
Great, thanks a lot. The next question is from Stuart Soroka.
Hi, Stuart.
He says, I might have missed this part of the new survey, but do you have evidence that anxiety is playing a role in current attitudes about COVID-19 and behaviors in response to those attitudes? Or is everything...
Okay.
Yep.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, there's one more line. Where was I? Oh, or is everything just totally overwhelmed by partisanship?
Thanks, Stuart. So right now we haven't done the modeling to show the kind of results of anxiety on behavior, but what we are finding, we do have questions about anxiety, which seem to be driven almost wholly by partisanship as well. So we have both that anxiety. So we have specific questions about worries about family becoming sick, about you becoming sick. We have questions about worries about the economy. All of those seem to be driven mostly by partisanship. The behaviors seem to be also driven by partisanship. That is the health behaviors. So it's a little bit unclear to me whether or not Republicans are less worried and therefore less compliant, or they're less compliant because they're getting messages from the administration that it is or at least at this point, right, in late March, this is a hoax, it's not very serious, we don't need to do anything, and therefore they also adjust their worries about it. I think it's a little bit hard in the data right now to tease that out. My instinct is that it's more about the elite cues in the end of March. We will be able to hopefully get some leverage on that question about which way the arrow is going in our new survey that's going out now, because we'll have variation in the states that people are living in, and whether or not they've changed in terms of the policies that they've implemented. So there will be Republicans who are now living in states that have more stay-at-home orders and more social distancing who did not in March. And so we can see whether or not some of that lack of compliance had to do with the policy, or it had to do with some messaging. We also have questions, as lots of surveys do, about people's media sources. So we'll be able to get some leverage again on whether or not the media sources people are taking in are kind of driving some of this behavior as well.
From Isabella Rabasso, she is a PhD student at the Hot Politics Lab. Thanks a lot for the talk. Did you measure trust in experts and health institutions in response to COVID-19? If so, does partisanship influence which experts people trust similarly to how it influences who they blame?
Yeah, thank you for the question. We do, on our next round of surveys, have a set of questions about trust in health institutions. So I'll be able to answer that question next time. And we have, so one of the things I didn't talk about in the earlier work on smallpox is we have a question about trust in the Surgeon General in the US in the smallpox study. In that question, the Surgeon General is kind of like what we'd call America's doctor, but they're a political appointee. And so in our study, we varied whether or not we describe the Surgeon General in the smallpox study as either a political appointee or a medical doctor with expertise in infectious disease, or we didn't describe her at all. And what we find in the smallpox study is that people put more trust in the Surgeon General when we describe her as an expert than as a political appointee. We are doing some of those same things in our second round of study in the COVID-19. We're varying how we talk about the director of the CDC as either, again, a political appointee or a medical expert. We'll also be asking about trust in Dr. Anthony Fauci, who is kind of the forefront of the messaging in the US on COVID-19. So I can't answer that right now, but we do have that lined up for the second round.
Next question from Shana. To what extent may these results be specific to the US case? Any insights about how partisanship plays a role in other countries and systems?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think we are at a time in the US where we're at a very high point of political polarization. And not only that the parties themselves are far apart on things like kind of on all sorts of issues, including issues of public health, at least at the federal level. The state levels are a little bit less polarized. But we're also at this kind of, I think, hopefully apex of negative partisanship, which is that people not only identify with their own party, but they dislike the party, the opposing party. And I think that poses some real challenges for both like creating anxiety that goes across parties and also implementing policies that could help keep everyone safe. So I think in less polarized systems, I think I've seen some evidence in the UK that this kind of variation in anxiety across parties is less. And I imagine that in less polarized systems, or in the US at less polarized times, we could see more, we'd be able to see more anxiety across parties and some more compliance. I think we would still see differences across parties, but the gaps should be smaller. So one of the, again, I think part of the story here in the US is the messaging from the Republican Party, particularly the president and right-wing media, has been to downplay the risks of COVID-19 from the beginning. Some of that has changed, but not substantially. And so I think when you see these variations in the ways in which the virus is being talked about as not a threat, or it's a threat, but it's just like the flu, we should see this variation. And so in other countries, if we don't see that kind of wide variation in definition of threat and then policies to go along with it, then I don't think we would see this same kind of partisanship split in other places.
Okay, question from the United States, Claire Cutro. I was wondering if you could give us any thoughts you have on the people protesting lockdowns and social distancing in Michigan, for example? Is it that they aren't experiencing the same anxiety as most people are? Or is it just the anxiety, or is it just that the anxiety is focused on something different, losing freedoms and civil liberties?
Sure, I think that's a great question. So I think it's probably more that the people who are protesting are anxious about economic losses, although some of the kinds of flags that we've been seeing at these protests suggest that they're also anxious about some social issues as well. So the kind of the Confederate flags and the Nazi flags that we've been seeing at these kinds of protests suggest that this is not just about economics. But I would suggest it's also less about anxiety necessarily than anger at the situations that people find themselves in, both economically precarious, right? So we are experiencing, as many places are, some extreme changes in economic situations for people in a very short amount of time. There have been more unemployment claims in the US in the last month than there were in the Great Depression. So I think there's a lot of economic precarity that has just come to the forefront, and that people are looking for someone to blame, and they're angry, and they're putting their blame on the kind of governors that they see as the kind of point people in keeping them economically precarious. So I think my instinct is that it's more about anger than it is about anxiety, because that's what motivates people to like leave their houses and go and keep themselves in danger to protest.
Great. Next question is for Bert Bakker.
Yeah, thank you, Shana, for this excellent talk. I have a question that relates to a puzzle that I've been having myself and I see this again in the data that you show on for instance the blame attribution, but also on the attitudes. And the question is, are we now seeing actual partisan motivated reasoning? So people invested in their parties vastly differencing in their attitudes, behaviors, and blame attribution? Or are we seeing what Greg Huber would call just cheap talk, in a sense that are people just signaling something? And so maybe focus a little bit more. My question on the attribution of blame is so Republicans and Democrats attribute blame to different actors. If you follow the sort of Marcus Pryor, John Bullock work, I wonder what would happen if you would, for instance, offer incentives. Like, is this, I'll pay you a little bit. Are they just signaling, well, just the other party, or would the effects differ? And the second question, and that relates maybe a little bit to, for instance, Martin Biscard's work recently in the HAPS, is that would there be ways that maybe people know the facts, but they just attribute blame differently? So they factually know that there might be a shortage of tests, there might be a shortage of supplies, but they still want to attribute blame. So the question is, or do you think that this is actually signs of partisan motivated reasoning in the way that we classically have been talking about this?
Yeah, so this is a good question, and I can only speak to what I think is going on, since we don't have any great, I think, leverage here. So one thing I'll say is I am somewhat skeptical, even though I use survey measures of behavior, right? I think it leads to this question of whether or not, are people actually washing their hands less, or are they just telling me they're washing their hands less? And this is not just Republicans. Are they saying they're doing it less just to say, well, this isn't a problem? Or are Democrats, are they saying, oh, I'm washing my hands more because that's the socially responsible thing to do right now? So I will say the findings that we see are consistent with the behavioral data that Matt Gankowski and his colleagues at Stanford have on cell phone data. So we can tell whether or not people are moving more based on where their cell phones are. And so we can actually see that in Republican and Democratic areas, which we know based on kind of election outcomes that Republicans are moving around more and they're less at home than Democrats. Okay, so I have some confidence that these are not just people telling us what they think we want to hear. But that doesn't actually answer your question about whether or not people are motivating themselves into this, or they're really just trying to stay consistent in this motivated reasoning way, or whether or not they want to signal something about blaming the other party. I tend to think that the blame attribution piece is a little bit of cheap talk. I think I don't want to put the blame on Trump either because I don't hold him to the same standards as others, or because I think of him as such a strong leader. And so whatever opportunity we gave Republicans to blame someone other than the president, they were going to take. Now, it isn't the case. So I don't really think they blame Barack Obama. I think it's just that's the opportunity we gave them to blame another party. So I do think there's a little bit of this cheap talk. And then perhaps if we gave people some incentive, they would kind of fall more in line with thinking about who is really in charge now. I mean, we do find the same kind of thing in attributing economic pain and benefits across a variety of things in parties. So this isn't all that different, right? Like we see this kind of thing, and like who gets the credit for a good economy is the party that I belong to and not the other party. So I do think it's very hard to kind of tease out whether this is some sort of partisan motivated reasoning. I think there's some of that, but I think more likely, at least in the blame attribution, this is a little bit of cheap talk.
Yeah. Thanks.
Let's move to 2 more questions. I will post them at the same time because they're very much related. The first is by Amanda Friesen, and the second by Martin Rosema. And so the questions go as follows. Have you looked at big 5 traits like neuroticism or conscientiousness in any of these connections between anxiety and public health scares? So that's Amanda's question. And then Martin says, linking up to Amanda's question, what are your key insights about potential moderating variables beyond partisanship? What elements of personality or contexts determine most strongly who's anxious and more anxious than others?
These are great questions, which I don't have great answers to, which is that we don't have any questions about the big 5, although now you're giving me ideas that we should. I keep asking funding agencies for more money to do more surveys. So maybe we ask on our 3rd round of surveys to get the big 5 on there as well. I guess because I don't have a great answer about personality. My instinct would be that conscientiousness is more related to the health behaviors than it would be to who becomes anxious in the first place. And so I think neuroticism is probably more likely to be kind of a undercurrent of who is easier to make anxious. I will also just say that I think it is fascinating to think about the ways in which the kind of the identity of partisanship seems to be this, at least in the US, an overriding identity at the moment. And part of that, I wonder, and we'll be able to see in our new data, is how much of this is about kind of social ties that people have to people of the other party, and whether people who live in kind of more mixed areas, mixed politically, will be more easily affected by the policy changes, and they'll have changed their behavior from one point to another. I am of the mind that partisanship and motivated reasoning are a very, very, very strong force in American politics. But I do think there is a time when, and this isn't an answer to the question, but this is like my more hopeful note. I do think there is a point where reality does in fact come in, and that people will start to know people who are affected by COVID-19, and that actual knowledge, in that personal knowledge, in their social networks, will at some point override the messages from elites. I am of them, you know, I do think elite messages and news messages are really, really strong and important, but I do think these personal experiences have the ability to override those messages from elites. Now, the question is whether or not that comes at a point when it's too late and we've had more suffering than we needed to, at least in some communities that haven't already kind of changed their social distancing. So that seemed hopeful, but I didn't actually end on a particularly hopeful note. So I didn't answer the question, which is, what are the other moderators? And I think, again, I think it's about, at this point, it has to be about personal experience, and it also the kind of maybe news media consumption is another moderator that might kind of override partisanship, to the extent that one of the kind of interesting things in the US is that local media consumption has gone up quite a bit. Local media was very kind of in trouble in the US. It is now kind of getting a renaissance because people are looking for local information about how to keep themselves protected. And so maybe that kind of local media will be able to kind of moderate the effects of partisanship, because it tends to be less partisan than national media.
That is a hopeful message. This actually relates to a question I was having, and this may be born out of ignorance regarding how Corona is spreading through the US. But the one thing I've heard is that New York is sort of the worst place in terms of the outbreak. How important? It seems to me that maybe the coronavirus is currently spreading faster in Democratic areas than Republican areas. How much do you think this has an effect in the results you've showed, especially given this personal experiences thing you just
Sure.
mentioned?
Yeah, no, I think that's really important, right? Is that people in different areas have different experiences with coronavirus. So New York, San Francisco, our major urban centers in the US are also more Democratic than Republican, and are Republican. And so this urban rural split means that Republicans who live in more rural areas might not have experienced as much of the virus as people who live in Democratic areas. So I do think that's the real kind of alternative explanation for why we're seeing Democrats do things differently. And also Democratic governors moved more, and mayors moved more quickly in terms of implementing social distancing. You know, our models control for the number of cases in the areas that people live in by zip code. We take into account urban-rural splits. We try to build that into the models as much as possible, and it still doesn't make the kind of partisanship effect go away. We would like to be able to, and we'll be able to see this in the new data, there are places that have Republican governors that went very quickly in their policy implementation of social distancing, Ohio and Maryland, for instance. We would like to be able to see whether or not Republicans in those places are different than Republicans other places. We just haven't been able to, we just don't have enough data right now in those places to make those inferences.
Yeah. Okay, that sounds interesting. Regarding differences between states, there's a question about this as well from Shana van Oosten. She's a PhD student at the University of Amsterdam. And she writes that the Netherlands is perceived as a medical laissez-faire culture. Doctors tend to prescribe less medicine, people aren't admitted in the hospitals quickly, etc. Do you know of any differences in medical cultures amongst the states you surveyed in? Or are there any states with similar levels of infected people and deaths, yet different policies? Could that have influenced your data in any way?
Oh, this is a good question. Federalism is very complicated in the US. And so any answer I usually give to like, why are things different across places is federalism. So I think the way we might be able to get at those differences across the states, however, this also tends to overlap with this Republican Democratic place, is that we have some healthcare systems that are somewhat more, I'm not sure laissez-faire is quite right because they're still for profit, so it's not that laissez-faire, but we have some health systems that are more integrated and more like a European kind of system in certain states. So the Kaiser system in California and on the West Coast tends to get better outcomes and also have, I think they prescribe less medicine and all those same things. The problem, I think, with that kind of variation is it also overlaps with partisanship in a way that I'm not sure helps us tease out things. The one way you might be able to get some inferences about this is looking on border states where people maybe tend to move more frequently across the border, maybe in the tri-state area in New York City, for instance. People live in Connecticut and New York and New Jersey and Pennsylvania, to see whether or not there are variations in just along the border, because they'll have different health systems, but similar kinds of people. I don't have a great answer, but I think it's an interesting question.
I've got two more questions, a short one,
Okay.
I think, and a very, very, very big one. And I will start with the short one.
Okay.
The short one is from Neil Fashing, a research master student from Amsterdam. And his question is, did you find independents were more similar in trust, anxiety, blame to Republicans or to Democrats? Do you think the results would differ if a more aggressive approach was taken by Trump?
So in the COVID-19 findings, we find that independents are like Democrats. They're somewhat in between, but they're more likely to be pursuing social distancing. They're more worried than Republicans. And the question of, do I think things would be different if the president was more aggressive in his messaging? Yes, absolutely, right? I think that again, I think elite cues and right-wing media are part of the issue in why Republicans are seeing less threat from COVID-19 and are less likely to report doing the kind of hand washing and all those things. Yeah.
Okay, now the big question, and then I think you could write a book about this. Martin Roosma again, his question is, I'm curious what you see as the path for emotion research in the next 10 years or so in political science. It's not really a question even, but.
So that's a great question. So what I'll tell you is what I wanted to do in the next 10 years instead of studying COVID-19. So I think that for emotions research, we've done a pretty good job in thinking about discrete emotions and how they matter and the ways in which they shape behavior. There's some interesting work coming out on anger. We have some kind of interesting work on disgust. I think what we know less about, and what I wanted to do again in my next project, but who knows when that will happen, is think about the ways in which emotions compete with each other and may undercut each other. I think we'd like to know more about, what I'd like to know more about is empathy and the ways in which empathy might be a kind of buffer against anxiety, and how positive emotions and negative emotions both occur at the same time, but do they neutralize each other? Does one dominate? I think we know less about that. And I think that would be an interesting path for anyone who is thinking about emotions research in the next couple of years. So Ted Brader and I are writing a kind of a chapter on emotions for the Handbook of Political Psychology, and so we'll tackle some of these issues. The other thing I think that a lot of the emotions, well, obviously not you guys, but a lot of the emotions literature has been very focused on the US, and I think we've thought less about what are the ethical implications of doing emotions research in, say, in comparative politics, particularly in authoritarian states? How do we think about whether or not we should be doing that research at all? What are the ways in which we can think about debriefing and keeping our research assistants safe if we're doing lab in the field kind of experiments with emotion, particularly in less safe areas? Right. So I think there's a lot of sort of interesting stuff going on in comparative politics. And I'm not sure that as a field we've had a lot of conversations about what are our obligations to the people who we're studying, our research assistants, and the field when we want to study places that might be less stable. So I have some thoughts on the area. I hope that you all continue to do the great work that you're doing, and I get to share it with you, and you get to share with me. And this has been really fun.
That sounds fascinating. We're really looking forward to reading that. We're out of time, unfortunately, and I give it now to Bert Bakker to conclude this meeting.
Yeah. So thank you, Shana, for this hour with great discussions on the role of emotions and anxiety in particular. I want to end with thanking you for spending the time with us. I also want to invite the people who are attending from all over the world today that next week Chris Karpovich and Josh Gubler will jointly talk about something that Shana was already hinting at a little bit, is what they call mixed affective state. So they're working on question of what are people experiencing distinct, discrete emotions, or might there be more mixed packages? So I think that's going to be really interesting. May 1, we have Melissa Baker from UC Merced and Ming Boyer from University of Vienna. May 8, we have Stephen Reicher from St. Andrews University. And on May 15, Gordon Pennycook from University of Regina. So a good mix of people from all over the world, I'd literally say. I hope that many of you will continue to join. And I want to thank you for your time and wish you a really good weekend.